The story of the Ottoman Empire begins not with grand palaces or mighty fleets, but in the rugged hills and valleys of northwestern Anatolia. In the early 14th century, the region was a mosaic of small Turkish principalities, each struggling for survival amidst the fading remnants of the Byzantine Empire and the encroaching Mongol influence. Among these, a small principality emerged under the leadership of a man named Osman, a leader whose vision would stretch far beyond the mountains he called home. His followers were not kings or generals of great renown. They were warriors, shepherds, and adventurers, people hardened by centuries of border conflicts and familiar with the harsh demands of frontier life. Yet under Osman's guidance, they became more than a band of fighters. They became the seed of a rising empire. Osman's genius lay not only in battle, but in strategy and diplomacy. He understood the delicate balance between war and alliance, conquest and negotiation. Towns that might have resisted him often submitted not to the sword, but to his reputation for fairness, his ability to honor local customs, and his willingness to integrate newly acquired peoples into his growing realm. Each victory was calculated, each step forward deliberate. By carefully choosing when to strike and when to consolidate, Osman laid the foundation for an empire that would not simply conquer, but endure. The Ottomans' rise coincided with the decline of their neighbors. Byzantium, once a formidable empire, had been weakened by centuries of internal strife, civil wars, and the pressures of crusaders and invading armies. Its cities, though still fortified, were isolated and under-resourced. The Seljuk Turks, once dominant in Anatolia, had fragmented into smaller emirates, each vulnerable to a more disciplined and unified force. Osman's principality, though small, was cohesive, ambitious, and adaptable. His victories in skirmishes and sieges spread his influence rapidly, attracting warriors and administrators eager to join a rising power. By the time Osman passed the mantle to his son, Orhan, the principality had transformed into a state with structured government, a professional army, and a vision for expansion. Orhan continued his father's work with unmatched vigor. He fortified towns, built bridges and roads to connect the new territories, and formalized tax systems that allowed the state to fund its armies without oppressing its people excessively. He also recognized the power of alliances. Marriages, oaths of loyalty, and treaties allowed the Ottomans to grow with minimal resistance from neighbors who underestimated their ambitions. The Ottomans' military innovations were subtle at first, but highly effective. Light cavalry skirmishes harried enemy forces, while fortified castles protected key regions. Unlike many empires that relied purely on brute force, the Ottomans blended intelligence, strategy, and psychological warfare. Enemy cities often surrendered after hearing tales of Ottoman discipline, organization, and the merciless efficiency of their raiding parties. Rumors of their cunning spread faster than the army itself, softening resistance before a sword was even drawn. Culturally, the early Ottomans were adept at assimilation. They absorbed elements of Byzantine administration, Seljuk traditions, and Islamic law to create a flexible system that allowed diverse populations to coexist under their rule. Religious tolerance within limits ensured that Greek Christians, Armenians, and Jews could live and work under Ottoman protection, contributing to the state's economy and stability. This blend of pragmatism and strength became a hallmark of the empire's longevity. As the Ottomans expanded into the Balkans, Europe began to take notice, though few yet realized the magnitude of what was rising. Small towns and principalities that had once been secure now faced the specter of a disciplined, organized, and ambitious neighbor. The Ottoman shadow, subtle at first, began to stretch over Europe's southeastern borders, whispering promises of conquest and stirring fear in distant courts. Historians often point to the early Ottoman period as a quiet time of growth, but in retrospect, it was anything but quiet. The rumblings of an empire that would shape the destiny of continents had begun, and the stage for centuries of drama was being set. By the end of this early period, the Ottomans were no longer merely a frontier principality. They had transformed into a power capable of challenging the great empires of the age. Their story was no longer one of survival. It was one of ambition, strategy, and vision. And though their shadow had barely reached Europe's heart, the seeds of fear, awe, and respect were already taking root. What began in the hills of Anatolia would grow into a force that would dominate the imagination of kings and the fate of nations for generations to come.
If the rise of the Ottoman state was a spark, the vision of its sultans became the flame that would ignite an empire. Leadership in this age was not merely a title, it was the embodiment of strategy, wisdom, and ambition. The early sultans understood that to survive and thrive, they could not rely solely on the sword. They needed institutions, law, diplomacy, and the delicate art of governance. From Orhan to Murad I, these leaders shaped a dynasty that blended the pragmatism of frontier life with the grandeur of imperial ambition. Orhan, Osman's son, was more than a soldier. He was a master administrator. Under his guidance, Bursa was transformed into a thriving capital. Roads, bridges, and public buildings connected the territories, making trade, communication, and troop movements faster and more efficient. He understood that controlling an empire was as much about managing people as it was about conquering land. Local governors were appointed carefully, balancing loyalty with competence, and the early Ottoman bureaucracy began to take shape. Through these measures, the state became a living, organized machine capable of responding swiftly to threats and seizing opportunities that others might overlook. Murad I, Orhan's successor, elevated the empire from a regional power into a force that could challenge the greatest kingdoms of Europe. He introduced military and administrative innovations that would define the Ottoman state for centuries. The Janissaries, an elite corps of soldiers recruited from Christian communities through the Devshirme system, became the backbone of his army. Trained rigorously and loyal only to the Sultan, they embodied discipline, strength, and fearlessness. Murad also established provincial governors, known as beys, whose authority extended across the empire, ensuring local compliance while reinforcing centralized power. But the Ottoman vision extended beyond administration and warfare. Diplomacy was a critical tool in their arsenal. While armies marched and cannons roared, sultans negotiated marriages, alliances, and treaties with neighboring states. Byzantines, Serbians, and other Balkan principalities often found themselves entangled in a web of diplomacy as intricate as any battlefield strategy. The Ottomans understood that a kingdom's submission could be won as effectively through cunning negotiation as through force. Letters, envoys, and gifts became weapons in a war waged as much in royal courts as on the battlefield. The sultans were also masters of perception. They cultivated an aura of inevitability around their rule. Tales of their decisiveness, generosity, and occasional ruthlessness spread quickly, creating a psychological advantage before any army even set foot in foreign lands. In the courts of Europe, whispers of the Ottoman threat grew louder, and rulers began to consider strategies not merely to resist armies, but to counter a rising ideology of power and efficiency. The Ottomans were teaching the world that empire was not solely measured in territory, but in influence, reputation, and fear. Culturally, the Ottoman vision embraced diversity and adaptability. The early sultans did not seek to erase the traditions of conquered peoples, but to incorporate them into the empire's expanding mosaic. Byzantine architects, artisans, and scholars were welcomed into Ottoman cities, contributing to public works, mosques, and fortresses. Religious communities, while subject to certain regulations, were allowed to maintain their faith and practices, ensuring stability and loyalty. This pragmatic tolerance became a key pillar of Ottoman longevity, allowing them to govern an empire of extraordinary diversity without constant rebellion. Murad I also had his eyes firmly set on Europe. The Balkans were not merely lands to be conquered, they were stepping stones to dominance. Campaigns in Thrace, Macedonia, and Serbia expanded Ottoman influence and secured strategic fortresses. The vision of the Sultan was clear: a bridge between East and West, where the empire would cast a long shadow over the European continent. The careful balance of force, diplomacy, and governance made it clear that the Ottomans were not merely another regional power. They were an empire with a plan, a purpose, and an unyielding ambition. The legacy of these early sultans would shape the empire for generations. They created institutions that endured, military structures that dominated the battlefield, and a culture that blended strength with sophistication. By the time Mehmed II ascended the throne, the Ottoman state was not just a collection of lands and armies. It was a living organism, capable of immense growth and astonishing conquest. Their vision had set the stage for an empire that would come to define an age, not merely in the East, but in the heart of Europe itself. And so the Ottoman sultans demonstrated a truth that would resonate through history. The power of a ruler is measured not only in the lands he conquers, but in the structures he leaves behind, the minds he influences, and the shadow he casts over the world. This vision would propel the empire toward feats that would awe the world and terrify the kings of Europe.
By the time the Ottoman Empire had solidified its foundations under the early sultans, its eyes had turned outward. The Anatolian heartland, once a patchwork of small principalities, had become a unified base from which the Ottomans could project power. But ambition cannot be contained within borders. The young empire looked east towards the crumbling remnants of the Seljuks and west toward the rich, fragmented kingdoms of the Balkans. What began as cautious raids and small campaigns soon transformed into strategic conquests that would alter the political map of both Europe and the Middle East. The Eastern campaigns were marked by a combination of military discipline and shrewd diplomacy. The Ottomans absorbed the smaller Turkish emirates into their growing state, often offering local rulers positions within the Ottoman administration in exchange for loyalty. This approach minimized resistance and allowed the empire to consolidate vast territories with surprising efficiency. Key cities were fortified, trade routes secured, and strategic garrisons established. Each victory was both a military achievement and a step toward administrative mastery, ensuring that conquest would be enduring rather than fleeting. In the West, the Balkans presented a different challenge. These lands were diverse, with a tapestry of Christian kingdoms, Byzantine remnants, and Slavic principalities. The Ottomans approached the Balkans with calculated precision. They exploited rivalries, formed temporary alliances, and struck decisively where resistance was weakest. Armies moved swiftly, sieges were meticulously planned, and psychological warfare was as vital as steel. Stories spread of Ottoman discipline and ruthlessness, often causing towns to surrender before the first arrow was fired. By the time the Ottomans reached the Danube and the plains of Macedonia, the European powers began to recognize that a new and unstoppable force had entered their midst. The conquests were not just about territory, they were about securing resources, controlling trade, and projecting influence. Agricultural lands were brought under Ottoman management, allowing for steady food supplies to support growing armies. Strategic fortresses commanded river crossings and mountain passes, making it difficult for enemies to maneuver. Cities became centers of administration and tax collection, further strengthening the empire. Each conquest, while violent and dramatic, was also calculated to ensure the empire's long-term survival and expansion. The Ottomans' military organization proved decisive. Cavalry units, skilled in rapid strikes and reconnaissance, dominated open fields. Infantry, including the early Janissary formations, provided disciplined firepower capable of withstanding the most determined resistance. Artillery, though still in its infancy compared to later centuries, was used with precision to break fortifications that had resisted previous generations of invaders. This combination of mobility, discipline, and innovation made the Ottoman army a force unlike any other in the region, feared by enemies and respected by allies. Culturally and politically, the Ottomans were shrewd. Conquered populations were often integrated rather than destroyed. Local elites were co-opted into the administration,
and religious tolerance within limits ensured relative stability. Christians and Jews could practice their faith under the millet system, paying taxes and swearing loyalty to the sultan, while maintaining communal autonomy. This pragmatic governance allowed the empire to expand rapidly without being bogged down by endless uprisings and rebellion. European rulers watched with a mix of awe and dread. The shadow of the Ottoman crescent stretched inexorably across the Balkans. Kingdoms that once considered themselves secure now faced the possibility of Ottoman armies at their gates. Diplomats scrambled to forge alliances, while spies reported on the growing military machine. The psychological impact of Ottoman conquests was profound. Fear of the empire became as important a factor in European politics as the armies themselves. Yet, the Ottomans did not conquer for conquest alone. Each campaign served a strategic purpose, building bridges, both literal and figurative, between East and West. Trade routes were secured, resources extracted, and cultural exchanges facilitated. The empire became a hub of commerce and knowledge, linking distant lands in a network of influence and power. Through these conquests, the Ottomans were not merely expanding, they were reshaping the world around them. By the end of this period of expansion, the Ottoman Empire had transformed from a regional principality into a force capable of challenging the established powers of Europe and the Middle East. Their army was feared, their diplomacy cunning, and their governance adaptable. Europe could no longer ignore the growing shadow cast by the Ottomans, for it was a shadow that would stretch across centuries, shaping the destinies of nations and empires alike. The stage was set for the empire's most legendary campaign yet, the Siege of Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, a city thought to be unconquerable. What would follow would not only cement the Ottomans' place in history, but send shockwaves through Europe, forever altering the balance of power.
The year was 1453, and the world was on the brink of transformation. Constantinople, the jewel of Byzantium, had stood for over a millennium as a symbol of endurance, faith, and human ingenuity. Its massive walls, layered in stone and mortar, had repelled countless invaders: Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and countless others. It was a city of legends, a treasure trove of art, culture, and wealth, perched strategically between Europe and Asia. To most, it seemed impregnable, a bastion of civilization against the rising tides of change. Yet for Mehmed II, the young Ottoman Sultan, its conquest was not a dream, it was a destiny. Mehmed II, barely 21 years old, was a leader of rare vision and determination. He had inherited an empire that was formidable, but he knew that a decisive victory against Constantinople would elevate the Ottomans from a regional power to a world-defining empire. He meticulously prepared for the siege, gathering an army that would dwarf the city's defenses. Tens of thousands of soldiers, elite janissaries, cavalry units, and specialized engineers gathered from across the empire. Massive cannons were transported across rugged terrain, some weighing dozens of tons, their barrels cast with precision to shatter walls that had withstood centuries of siege. The Byzantines, aware of the looming threat, fortified their defenses and sought aid from Western Europe. Yet the pleas for assistance arrived too late, and the fragmented response from distant kingdoms did little to bolster the city. Within the walls, soldiers and citizens prepared for a battle that would test every ounce of courage, ingenuity, and resilience. From the highest towers, archers and artillery crews scanned the horizon, eyes fixed on the Ottoman forces amassing below. The tension was palpable, a mixture of fear, resolve, and desperate hope that somehow the impossible might be achieved. The siege began in earnest. Mehmed II deployed strategies that combined relentless pressure with cunning innovation. Cannons roared day and night, battering the city walls, sending plumes of smoke and clouds of dust into the sky. Ottoman engineers dug tunnels beneath fortifications, attempting to undermine the massive stone walls. Archers and infantry engaged in skirmishes, probing for weaknesses while keeping the defenders off balance. The noise of war, clashing steel, shouting soldiers, and the thunder of artillery echoed across the surrounding hills, a relentless symphony of conquest. Despite the overwhelming odds,
the defenders fought with extraordinary valor. Byzantine soldiers, sailors, and citizens joined together in a desperate attempt to hold their city. They patched walls under bombardment, repelled assaults on the gates, and countered Ottoman advances with ingenuity and courage. Every day was a test of endurance, a battle of wills as Mehmed II's forces pressed forward with increasing intensity. The young sultan watched every move, adjusting strategies, exploiting weaknesses, and inspiring his army with speeches that emphasized destiny, honor, and the glory that awaited victory. After weeks of relentless siege, the turning point arrived. A combination of superior artillery, disciplined infantry assaults, and precise coordination overwhelmed the defenders. On May 29th, the impossible happened. Constantinople was breached. The walls surmounted, and the city surrendered to Mehmed II. For the Byzantines, it was the end of an era. A civilization that had endured centuries of turmoil now succumbed to a force that had been quietly building for generations. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul marked a new epoch. Mehmed II proclaimed it the new capital of the Ottoman Empire, a city that would symbolize the empire's grandeur, strength, and ambition. Palaces, mosques, and public works flourished, drawing scholars, artists, and traders from across the world. The city became a hub of commerce and culture, bridging East and West, Muslim and Christian, old and new. For Europe, the fall of Constantinople was a shock that reverberated for decades, altering trade routes, military strategies, and political alliances. The Ottoman shadow now stretched across the continent in ways few had imagined possible. The siege of Constantinople was not merely a military conquest. It was a demonstration of vision, planning, and ambition. Mehmed II's victory was a testament to the discipline of the Ottoman army, the ingenuity of its engineers, and the relentless determination of its leader. It marked the rise of an empire that would dominate the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and the Middle East for centuries, forever changing the course of history. And so, with the walls of Constantinople breached and the city under Ottoman control, a new chapter in human history began, one defined by power, culture, and the inexorable reach of an empire whose shadow would loom over Europe for generations.
With Constantinople firmly under Ottoman control, the empire had reached a new level of power, and its influence began to cast a long and unyielding shadow across Europe. The fall of the city was not merely a military triumph, it was a psychological earthquake. European kingdoms, long accustomed to seeing the Ottomans as a distant threat, now faced the tangible reality of an empire at their very doorstep. From the courts of Vienna to the streets of Venice, diplomats, generals, and monarchs grappled with fear, uncertainty, and the urgent need to respond to a rising power whose ambition knew no bounds. The Ottoman shadow extended far beyond mere geography. Their armies could appear almost anywhere in the Balkans with astonishing speed, and news of their victory spread like wildfire, creating panic and forcing states to rethink their strategies. Alliances were forged in haste, often between former rivals, in a desperate attempt to counterbalance Ottoman influence. Kings and princes realized that diplomacy alone would not suffice. They needed military preparedness, strategic coordination, and constant vigilance. Yet even the most coordinated European plans were haunted by the knowledge that the Ottomans possessed not only might, but ingenuity and adaptability. Trade routes shifted as well. Mediterranean merchants who had once freely navigated between Italian city-states, the Levant and the Black Sea, now faced Ottoman-controlled ports, tariffs, and patrols. The empire's growing naval capabilities ensured that Europe's access to Eastern goods, spices, silk, and precious metals, was increasingly under Ottoman supervision. Venice, Genoa, and other maritime powers scrambled to secure treaties and bribes, realizing that commerce had become a new battlefield, one where diplomacy and economic strategy were as vital as swords and cannons. In the Balkans, the human cost of the Ottoman shadow was immediate and tangible. Cities and towns adapted to the new rulers, often paying tribute, providing soldiers, or navigating the delicate balance between cooperation and rebellion. Christian populations found themselves living under Islamic governance, sometimes with relative tolerance, other times under strict control.
The millet system allowed communities to maintain religious practices, but it also underscored the reality that Europe was no longer the sole custodian of power in the region. The Ottoman presence was omnipresent, shaping daily life, politics, and culture. European military strategists were both awed and terrified by Ottoman organization. Armies were well-trained, disciplined, and adaptable. Cavalry could strike swiftly, infantry held steadfast lines, and artillery, constantly refined, could batter fortifications that had seemed impregnable. Rumors of elite janissaries, soldiers loyal only to the Sultan, spread fear across borders, their reputation preceding them. Europe began to understand that the Ottomans were not just a regional threat, they were a strategic force that could outmaneuver, outthink, and overpower traditional armies. The Ottoman shadow also reached into the intellectual and cultural spheres of Europe. Scholars, cartographers, and diplomats studied the empire, trying to understand its systems of governance, law, and military efficiency. Treatises and letters circulated, warning of the Ottomans' tactical genius and the empire's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. It was no longer enough to rely on tradition. European rulers realized they were witnessing a new kind of power, one that combined military strength, administrative sophistication, and cultural integration into a force that could dominate regions with unmatched effectiveness. Yet fear did not breed only despair. It also fostered resistance and innovation. European states began modernizing armies, building fortifications, and developing new tactics to counter Ottoman advances. The shadow of the empire forced collaboration, spurred technological advancements, and reshaped diplomacy. Every move the Ottomans made reverberated across Europe, forcing kings, princes, and generals to confront the reality of a power that would shape the continent's future. Religious dynamics added another layer of tension. The Ottoman Empire, an Islamic state, now ruled over significant Christian populations. The fall of Constantinople had already rattled Christendom, and the expansion of Ottoman influence into the Balkans and Central Europe fueled fears of further incursions. Religious leaders in Europe called for unity and crusades, attempting to rally states under the banner of faith. But the Ottomans' pragmatic governance, tolerance in daily administration, and focus on strategy over ideology often mitigated outright rebellion, creating a complex interplay between fear, respect, and reluctant accommodation. Through all this, the empire's leaders understood the power of perception. Europe's growing anxiety was in itself a form of influence. The mere threat of Ottoman forces could compel cities to surrender, kings to negotiate, and populations to comply. It was a shadow that moved faster than armies, a psychological edge that complemented the empire's physical power. The Ottomans had mastered not only war and governance, but the art of shaping the perception of power, extending their influence far beyond the reach of their swords. By the middle of the 15th century, it was clear that Europe had entered a new era. The Ottoman Empire was no longer a distant curiosity, it was a defining force, reshaping politics, commerce, and military strategy. Its shadow stretched across continents, leaving an indelible mark on the map and the consciousness of Europe. Monarchs understood that survival would depend on vigilance, innovation, and careful diplomacy. And for the Ottomans, the stage was set for further expansion, their ambition undimmed, their vision clear, to cast a shadow that would be felt for centuries to come.
The Ottoman Empire's shadow over Europe and the Middle East was not only a product of diplomacy and vision, it was forged in steel, discipline, and relentless innovation. By the mid-15th century, the Ottomans had created a military force unlike any other in the world, a machine of war that combined tradition, strategy, and cutting-edge tactics. This army was not merely an instrument of conquest, it was the backbone of an empire, the visible and terrifying symbol of the Sultan's power, and a decisive factor in shaping the course of history. At the core of this military machine were the Janissaries, an elite corps of soldiers whose reputation would echo across continents. Recruited through the Devshirme system, young boys were taken from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained from a young age to serve the Sultan. They were indoctrinated with loyalty, rigor, and discipline, transforming them into warriors who feared neither death nor adversity. Their training was harsh, their lives regimented, but their prowess in battle was unmatched. The Janissaries were not only infantry, they were shock troops,
administrators, and advisors, embodying the strength and cunning of the empire itself. Cavalry units added mobility and flexibility to the Ottoman army. Light cavalry, skilled in rapid maneuvers and hit-and-run tactics, could harass enemy flanks and disrupt supply lines. Heavy cavalry, armored and disciplined, charged with devastating force, breaking enemy formations and creating openings for infantry to exploit. This combination of speed and power allowed the Ottomans to adapt to varied terrains, whether the rugged mountains of the Balkans or the open plains of Anatolia. Every unit had a role, every movement was calculated, and the entire system functioned like a clockwork instrument of war. Artillery, a relatively new addition to medieval warfare, became a decisive factor under Ottoman innovation. Massive cannons, designed to breach previously impregnable walls, transformed sieges into battles of science and engineering as much as of brute force. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 stands as the ultimate testament to the power of Ottoman artillery. The thunderous roar of cannons day and night battered stone and mortar until the walls that had withstood centuries of siege finally gave way. Engineers and gunners, trained in precision and innovation, turned technological advancement into an instrument of empire. Tactical ingenuity extended beyond firepower. The Ottomans employed spies, scouts, and intelligence networks to gather information, anticipate enemy moves, and exploit weaknesses. Terrain was studied and utilized strategically. Rivers, mountains, and forests were incorporated into battle plans to gain advantage over foes who underestimated the empire's adaptability. Siege engines, fortifications, and logistical planning ensured that campaigns could be sustained over months, even years, without collapse. Every aspect of warfare was methodical, disciplined, and highly organized. The psychological impact of the Ottoman military was immense. Stories of janissaries' ferocity, of cannons tearing through walls, and of swift cavalry charges spread far beyond the battlefield. Cities surrendered without a fight when the shadow of Ottoman banners appeared on the horizon, and European leaders adjusted their policies out of fear and respect. War was not only physical but psychological. The Ottomans had mastered the art of making themselves feared, respected, and seemingly invincible. Naval power, though often overshadowed by land campaigns, became increasingly vital. The Ottoman Navy controlled key Mediterranean trade routes, projecting influence across the seas and challenging European maritime powers. Ships were built for speed and firepower, crews trained for combat, and admirals skilled in navigation and strategy. The combination of land and sea forces allowed the empire to exert influence far beyond its borders, ensuring that the shadow of Ottoman power touched both continents and oceans. The military machine was also an instrument of statecraft. Victory on the battlefield translated directly into political authority, economic control, and cultural influence. Conquered regions were integrated into the empire's administrative system, ensuring stability and long-term dominance. Soldiers were not just warriors, they were enforcers of law, collectors of tribute, and symbols of the sultan's authority. Every campaign strengthened the empire's reach and reinforced its image as a power that could not be ignored. Through discipline, innovation, and vision, the Ottoman military became the engine of an empire destined to leave an indelible mark on history. It was not merely an army, it was a living symbol of strategy, organization, and ambition. Across Europe and the Middle East, rulers understood that the Ottoman military machine was more than numbers and weapons. It was a force that would shape politics, culture, and destiny for centuries to come. And so the empire's armies continued to advance, their shadow growing longer with each victory, from the plains of Anatolia to the heart of the Balkans, from fortified cities to open seas. The Ottoman military machine was a constant, unstoppable presence. A reminder that ambition, discipline, and vision could turn a principality into one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen.
The Ottoman Empire's greatness was not built on conquest alone. While armies marched and cannons roared across Europe and Asia, the true strength of the empire lay also in its culture, knowledge, and economic prosperity. Istanbul, newly established as the capital, became the beating heart of an empire that stretched from the Anatolian highlands to the Balkans. a city where ambition met intellect and power blended seamlessly with art and science. Here, wealth was not merely measured in gold, but in ideas, architecture, learning, and human achievement. The transformation of Istanbul into a cultural hub was deliberate and visionary. Scholars, architects, artists, and poets were drawn to the city from across the empire and beyond. Byzantine scholars, once subjects of the fallen Constantinople, were welcomed into Ottoman institutions, bringing with them manuscripts, knowledge, and traditions that have been preserved for centuries. Islamic scholars added their own expertise, creating a unique fusion of East and West, classical and contemporary, science and spirituality. Libraries were filled with texts from Persia, the Arab world, and Europe, making Istanbul a beacon of learning for students and thinkers alike. Architecture became a signature of Ottoman culture. Magnificent mosques, palaces, and public buildings dotted the cityscape, their domes and minarets rising as symbols of both faith and imperial ambition. The intricate tile work, delicate calligraphy, and geometric patterns reflected a civilization that valued beauty, order, and sophistication. Each building was more than a functional structure. It was a statement of power, vision, and the empire's ability to blend artistic mastery with political authority. The Hagia Sophia, transformed into a mosque, stood as a testament to the Ottomans' ability to honor the past while asserting their dominance and vision for the future. Economic prosperity underpinned cultural and intellectual achievement. Trade flowed through the empire's vast territories, connecting the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and beyond. Merchants brought spices, silk, and precious metals, while local artisans produced textiles, ceramics, and intricate metalwork. Markets bustled with activity, offering goods from distant lands and showcasing the wealth and diversity of the empire. Taxes were collected efficiently, infrastructure maintained, and wealth circulated in ways that strengthened both cities and the countryside. Istanbul was not only the seat of power, but the hub of commerce, innovation, and opportunity. Religious and cultural diversity was carefully managed through pragmatic governance. The millet system allowed religious communities to maintain their faith, legal structures, and traditions while remaining loyal to the sultan. This tolerance encouraged stability, fostered loyalty, and allowed various ethnic and religious groups to contribute to the empire's economic and cultural life. Christians, Jews, and Muslims coexisted under Ottoman rule, creating a vibrant and diverse society that fueled both creativity and social cohesion. Science and learning flourished alongside art and commerce. Astronomers, mathematicians, engineers, and physicians found patronage in the Ottoman court. Knowledge of the stars, maps of distant lands, innovations in medicine, and advances in engineering were pursued with vigor. The empire became a conduit of ideas, bridging East and West, preserving ancient knowledge while pushing the boundaries of discovery. Innovations in architecture, military technology, and navigation were not only practical, but also emblematic of a civilization that valued intellect as highly as power. The Ottoman court itself became a center of sophistication and influence. Sultans, while commanding armies, also acted as patrons of the arts and letters. Poets recited verses praising the empire, painters immortalized its glory, and musicians filled palaces and streets with sound. The court projected power through both spectacle and substance, demonstrating to subjects and rivals alike that the Ottomans were a civilization of refinement as well as strength. Even as the empire expanded, Istanbul remained a magnet for talent. Artisans, scholars, and merchants from across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia were drawn by opportunity, protection, and prestige. The city's wealth and cultural richness symbolized the empire's ability to integrate diversity, harness talent, and turn knowledge into lasting power. This was an empire that understood the soft power of culture, that influence could be exercised not only through armies, but through beauty, intellect, and prosperity. By the late 15th century, the Ottoman Empire had become a dual marvel, a military powerhouse and a cultural beacon. Its armies instilled fear, its sultan commanded respect, and its cities shone as centers of wealth, learning, and innovation.
Istanbul stood as the ultimate symbol of this synthesis, a city where conquest met culture and where the shadow of the empire stretched far and wide, touching the lives of those within its borders and beyond. The Ottoman Empire's legacy in culture, knowledge, and wealth would endure for centuries, influencing architecture, science, governance, and art throughout Europe and the Middle East. It was a reminder that true power is not measured solely in territory or armies, but in the ability to cultivate civilization itself, an empire whose shadow was as much about brilliance and sophistication as it was about fear and conquest.
While the Ottoman Empire's armies carved a path across Anatolia and the Balkans, another front was quietly shaping the empire's destiny: the seas. Control of the Mediterranean was not only a matter of prestige, but a strategic necessity. Trade, communication, and the projection of power all depended on mastery of the waters. Recognizing this, the Ottomans developed a formidable navy, transforming the empire into a force capable of dominating both land and sea. The Mediterranean of the 15th and 16th centuries was a theater of competition. Venice, Genoa, and other maritime powers had long controlled trade routes, ports, and naval routes, enriching themselves while maintaining influence over the flow of goods and ideas. The Ottomans, however, were not content to merely coexist. They invested in shipbuilding, creating galleys that combined speed, firepower, and durability. Ottoman shipyards hummed with activity as carpenters, engineers, and artisans labored to produce vessels that could challenge even the most seasoned European fleets. Training was rigorous. Crews learned navigation, tactics, and boarding maneuvers. Commanders studied both the seas and their enemies, understanding that naval dominance required not only ships, but strategy, coordination, and discipline. Armadas were organized with precision. Galleys, equipped with cannons, spearheaded assaults. Transports carried troops and supplies. Scouts navigated the waters to ensure safe passage and gather intelligence. Each fleet was a microcosm of the empire's broader military machine, efficient, coordinated, and adaptable. The Ottomans' rise as a naval power quickly reshaped the Mediterranean's balance. Islands, ports, and key coastal cities fell under Ottoman control, creating a network of influence that extended from the Aegean to North Africa. Control of sea routes allowed the empire to protect trade, transport armies efficiently, and threaten European powers in new and unexpected ways. Venice and Genoa, once unchallenged, found themselves negotiating treaties and paying tribute to secure their interests. The Ottomans had become masters of the Mediterranean, projecting power far beyond their lands and reshaping commerce and politics with every victory. Naval battles were dramatic, brutal, and decisive. Ships collided in cloudy seas, cannons thundered, and boarding parties fought with ferocious skill. The Ottoman Navy relied not only on numbers, but on tactics that outmaneuvered slower or less disciplined fleets. Knowledge of wind, currents, and coastal geography was used to maximum advantage, while discipline and coordination ensured that even in chaos, the fleet acted as a single entity. Tales of these battles spread across Europe, inspiring both fear and admiration. Ottoman sailors, like their land-based counterparts, became legends, symbols of the empire's reach, skill, and relentless ambition. Control of the seas also amplified the empire's economic strength. Key trade routes previously dominated by Venetian and Genoese merchants were now under Ottoman oversight. Silk, spices, precious metals, and other goods flowed through Ottoman ports, providing wealth that funded further expansion, patronage of the arts, and the construction of monumental architecture. Maritime dominance allowed the empire to influence distant regions without necessarily sending armies, reinforcing the notion that the Ottoman shadow was as much about strategic positioning as raw military force. Beyond commerce, the navy allowed the Ottomans to intervene in European affairs, project influence into North Africa, and challenge emerging naval powers such as Spain and Portugal. Control of the Mediterranean ensured that the empire could strike swiftly, respond to threats, and maintain supply lines, making it a formidable opponent, both on land and at sea. This dual capability, the combination of an unstoppable army and a dominant navy, cemented the Ottomans' position as a world power, feared and respected across continents.
The psychological impact of naval supremacy was profound. European powers knew that Ottoman ships could appear unexpectedly along coastlines, raid towns, or disrupt trade, compelling states to divert resources, fortify ports, and strengthen fleets. The shadow of the Ottoman Empire now extended across both land and water, a constant presence that shaped strategy, commerce, and diplomacy alike. Through naval mastery, the empire projected power far beyond its borders, demonstrating that true dominance required not only conquest of land, but also control of vital trade routes and seas. The Mediterranean became an arena where the Ottomans showcased their ingenuity, discipline, and ambition. Their shadow now enveloped Europe in a way that was impossible to ignore, a combination of military might, economic influence, and strategic vision that defined the empire's enduring strength. By the late 15th century, the Ottomans had become masters of both continents and waters. Their armies stormed cities and fortresses, while their navy ruled the seas, ensuring that the empire's reach was vast, adaptable, and nearly unstoppable. The Mediterranean had been transformed into an Ottoman domain, a stage upon which the empire's power, strategy, and vision were displayed for all to see. And yet, even as this dominance solidified, the empire faced challenges from Europe and from within that would test its resilience and adaptability in the centuries to come.
Even the greatest empires faced trials, and the Ottoman Empire was no exception. As its borders expanded across Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Mediterranean, the empire encountered both external pressures and internal complexities that would test its resilience. Conquest had brought immense wealth, influence, and power, but with expansion came diversity, dissent, and the constant threat of rebellion. The true strength of the Ottomans would be revealed not only on the battlefield, but in their ability to navigate these challenges with strategy, governance, and adaptability. Externally, European powers were never idle. Venice, Hungary, Poland, and later the Habsburgs sought to contain Ottoman influence, forming alliances, raising armies, and attempting to slow the empire's relentless expansion. Battles erupted across the Balkans, from the plains of Serbia to the mountainous regions of Albania. Even as the Ottomans projected strength, these confrontations tested their armies, leadership, and logistics. Each engagement required careful planning. Sieges had to be coordinated, supplies maintained, and morale kept high. The empire's ability to adapt to diverse terrain and military tactics became a hallmark of its enduring success. Piracy and naval competition added another layer of complexity. While the Ottoman navy dominated much of the Mediterranean, European privateers, corsairs, and rival fleets constantly challenged Ottoman maritime control. Protecting trade routes, ensuring safe passage for goods, and maintaining naval supremacy demanded constant vigilance, innovation, and investment in both ships and skilled sailors. Naval skirmishes, raids on coastal towns, and intelligence gathering became routine aspects of Ottoman strategy, demonstrating that power was not static, but required continual effort and oversight. Internally, the empire faced its own set of challenges. Governing a vast multi-ethnic, multi-religious population required careful balance. The millet system allowed religious communities to manage their own affairs, but this autonomy could breed tension if not carefully monitored. Local leaders sometimes resisted Ottoman authority, and distant provinces occasionally experienced uprisings fueled by resentment, economic grievances, or external influence. The sultans and their administrators had to maintain loyalty through a combination of diplomacy, strategic appointments, and decisive military action when necessary. Succession posed another internal threat. Ottoman sultans ruled with near-absolute authority, but disputes over succession could fracture the court and the empire itself. Ambitious princes, often supported by factions within the court, sometimes challenged the sultan, leading to internal conflict and political maneuvering that required careful resolution. These struggles were not merely personal, they threatened the stability of the entire empire. To manage this, the Ottomans implemented measures such as fratricide or confinement to prevent open conflict, ensuring that the throne remained secure while simultaneously instilling fear and discipline among potential rivals. Economic pressures also tested the empire. The vast territories required efficient administration to collect taxes, fund armies, and support infrastructure. Trade fluctuations, poor harvests, or disruptions caused by conflict could ripple across the empire, affecting both cities and rural areas.
Administrators were tasked with balancing taxation, maintaining public order, and ensuring that the wealth of the empire could sustain both its ambitious military campaigns and the cultural prosperity that had become its hallmark. Despite these challenges, the Ottomans demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Governors were rotated to prevent the rise of local power bases. Military reforms kept armies disciplined, and diplomacy was used as effectively as the sword. The empire's leaders understood that resilience required not just conquest, but careful management of human, political, and economic resources. The ability to integrate diverse peoples, harness loyalty, and adapt to changing circumstances was what allowed the empire to survive trials that might have destroyed lesser states. The shadow of the Ottoman Empire, though challenged, remained unbroken. European powers continued to fear and respect it, knowing that internal strife or external pressure could slow the empire but not easily defeat it. The challenges it faced, rebellions, wars, succession disputes, and economic pressures, were met with a combination of strategic insight, administrative skill, and decisive leadership. In doing so, the empire solidified its identity as a force that could endure, adapt, and expand despite adversity. By the early 15th century, the empire had proven that its strength was not merely the sum of its armies or wealth, but its ability to manage complexity. The combination of military prowess, administrative innovation, and cultural sophistication allowed the Ottoman Empire to withstand crises both within and beyond its borders. Its shadow continued to stretch across Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East, a testament to resilience, vision, and the enduring power of strategy. As the empire looked to the future, the stage was set for further glory, ambition, and challenges that would define its legacy. The Ottoman story was far from complete, and the balance between conquest, culture, and control would shape the next chapters of a civilization whose shadow would endure for centuries.
The Ottoman Empire, after centuries of expansion, conquest, and governance, left a shadow that stretched far beyond the territories it controlled. Its story is not just one of armies, sieges, and political intrigue. It is a story of endurance, culture, innovation, and influence that shaped the course of history across continents. From the fall of Constantinople to the dominance of the Mediterranean, from administrative genius to architectural marvels, the Ottomans left a legacy that endures even today. At the heart of this legacy was the empire's ability to blend power with culture. Cities like Istanbul, Edirne, and Bursa were more than administrative centers. They were symbols of Ottoman vision and sophistication. Magnificent mosques, palaces, bridges, and marketplaces reflected an empire that valued beauty, order, and functionality. Scholars studied, artisans created, and merchants thrived, ensuring that prosperity and innovation were as integral to the empire as its military might. Knowledge and art were not luxuries, but instruments of influence, helping to unify a diverse empire and projecting its power across the world. The Ottoman military machine, which had conquered continents and reshaped borders, left a lasting imprint on warfare. The Janissaries, disciplined and loyal, set new standards for infantry. The cavalry and artillery demonstrated the strategic integration of mobility, firepower, and organization. European armies studied Ottoman tactics, adapting and learning from their victories and innovations. The empire's approach to military organization, logistics, and strategy influenced warfare for centuries, proving that the Ottomans were not only conquerors, but teachers of the art of war. Administratively, the empire created a system that balanced central authority with local autonomy, allowing it to govern vast, diverse populations effectively. The millet system allowed religious and ethnic communities to maintain their traditions while remaining loyal to the sultan, creating stability across a multicultural empire. Provincial governors enforced laws and collected taxes, while the central bureaucracy ensured cohesion, enabling the empire to respond swiftly to both internal and external challenges. This combination of flexibility and control became a model for governance, inspiring other states and empires in later centuries. Trade and economics were also central to Ottoman legacy. Control of strategic routes, ports, and cities enabled the empire to dominate commerce across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Wealth flowed into cities, funding public works, cultural projects, and military campaigns.
The empire's strategic position between continents turned it into a bridge for ideas, goods, and innovation, making it not only a political and military power, but also an economic and cultural hub. The Ottoman Empire's shadow extended into Europe, influencing politics, culture, and perception for centuries. Its presence forced European states to innovate militarily, strengthen alliances, and rethink diplomacy. Fear of Ottoman armies shaped decisions in Vienna, Rome, and beyond, while admiration for their administrative and cultural sophistication inspired scholars, diplomats, and rulers alike. The empire's reach was not just physical, it was psychological and cultural, leaving an imprint on the consciousness of nations far beyond its borders. Religion and culture intertwined with power, leaving a legacy of coexistence, pragmatism, and adaptation. While Islamic governance prevailed, diverse communities were accommodated and traditions preserved. This balance fostered stability and enriched the empire's cultural tapestry. Architecture, art, literature, and science flourished under Ottoman patronage, leaving an enduring mark on the cities, institutions, and societies it governed. Yet perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Ottoman legacy was the concept of vision itself. From Osman and Orhan to Mehmed II and Suleiman the Magnificent, the sultans understood that an empire's strength lay not just in conquest, but in strategy, innovation, and perception. They combined military might with governance, culture, and diplomacy, creating a civilization that could endure, adapt, and project influence across centuries. Their shadow was not a fleeting one. It was a force that shaped the destinies of nations, borders, and peoples long after armies had moved on. As centuries passed and empires rose and fell, the Ottoman legacy continued to resonate. Architecture inspired future generations, administrative principles influenced governance, and the empire's cultural achievements endured in art, literature, and scholarship. The story of the Ottomans is a reminder that power, when coupled with vision, strategy, and adaptability, leaves a mark far greater than land or gold ever could. The shadow that remains is not of fear alone. It is a shadow of influence, achievement, and human ambition. It is the shadow of an empire that rose from a small principality to a civilization that commanded continents, shaped cultures, and inspired generations. From the bustling streets of Istanbul to the distant reaches of Europe and the Mediterranean, the Ottoman legacy endures, a testament to what vision, power, and ingenuity can achieve. The Ottoman Empire may have faded from its temporal throne, but its shadow, immense and enduring, continues to shape history, reminding the world that greatness is measured not only by what one conquers, but by the structures, culture, and vision one leaves behind.
If you enjoyed this video and are still not subscribed, please consider it, as it really helps me out a lot. Thank you.